The ocean does not keep secrets. This is the first lesson taught to every oceanographer, every navigator, every sailor who has ever dared to map its depths. The sea is a realm of brutal, unforgiving physics, of currents and tides governed by the immutable laws of temperature, salinity, and the turning of the earth. Its pathways can be understood, mapped, and predicted. We believe we know its roads as well as we know the streets of our own cities. But what if there is a road on that map that should not exist? A phantom current, a ghost river in the sea, that appears and vanishes at will, a pathway that defies every law we thought we understood. My name is Carlos Mendoza. My work has led me to the edge of the known world, to the place where the clear hard lines of science begin to blur with the ghosts of the past. And I have learned that sometimes the most profound anomalies in our data are not errors in our machines, but echoes of a forgotten discovery, a stolen truth, a brilliant mind that saw a secret in the waves that the rest of the world was blind to. The story I am about to share with you begins not with a haunting, but with a single, impossible data point in a sea of trillions. It is the story of a modern scientist who, while trusting the unerring logic of her satellites, found herself in a dialogue with a 300-year-old ghost. A ghost who was not trying to cause fear, but was trying to correct a map. This is not the story of a treasure ship or a sea monster. This is the story of a lost current, a stolen legacy, and the woman who drew the map to a ghost. This is the tale of the navigator's anomaly. Her name is Dr. Aris Thorne. In the world of physical oceanography, she is a rising star, a data priestess who can read the story of the planet in the subtle shifts of sea surface temperatures and satellite altimetry. Her life's work is the pursuit of prediction, of taming the ocean's chaos into a perfect, predictable model. She commands a fleet of satellites, an army of deep-sea buoys, and a supercomputer that can simulate the movement of every drop of water in the Atlantic. She is a woman who has dedicated her life to the idea that there are no more ghosts on the map, no more sea serpents in the margins. Every mystery, she believes, is simply a problem of insufficient data. Her current project was supposed to be a career-defining one, to create the most accurate, high-resolution model of the North Atlantic currents in history. A model so precise, it could revolutionize the multi-trillion-dollar global shipping industry. For months, the project had been a stunning success. Her model was beautiful, elegant, and almost perfectly aligned with the observed reality. Almost the problem was a ghost in her machine, a single, recurring, and utterly infuriating anomaly. In a specific, desolate quadrant of the North Atlantic, a place known for its treacherous, chaotic waters, her satellites would occasionally register a current that her model insisted could not exist. It was a river of warm, fast-moving water, appearing for a few hours or a few days at a time, moving against the prevailing flows, before vanishing without a trace. It was a statistical impossibility, a phantom current. To Aris, it was a flaw in her data, a bug in her perfect system, and it was driving her to the edge of obsession. Her colleagues urged her to dismiss it, to write it off as instrument error or a transient atmospheric event. But the signal was too clean, too structured. It was a ghost that left footprints. Driven by a need to understand this flaw, Aris began to dig, not into her modern data, but into the past. She started researching the history of navigation in that specific, anomalous quadrant of the sea. She cross-referenced the logbooks of naval vessels, merchant ships, and explorers from the last 3 centuries, looking for any mention of strange, unpredictable currents. That is when she first encountered the name of Captain Alistair Finch. To naval historians, Finch was a legend, a celebrated 17th-century explorer and privateer, a man who had made his name and his fortune by navigating the treacherous North Atlantic routes in record-breaking times. His logbooks spoke of a secret, a divine current he called the Serpent's Path, which allowed him to outrun pirates and naval blockades alike. History had recorded him as a navigator of almost supernatural skill, a man who could read the sea's hidden language. His secret route, the Finch Passage, was the foundation of his celebrated legacy. Aris obtained a digital copy of Finch's original logbook. As she read his arrogant, self-aggrandizing prose, she found his descriptions of the Serpent's Path to be frustratingly vague, more poetic than scientific. It was the writing of a man guarding a trade secret, but it was in the back of the logbook, in a section marked Apprentice's Notes, that she found the first thread of the real story. Tucked away, almost as an afterthought, was a second map of the same region. This one was different. It was drawn with a hand that was precise, analytical, almost scientific. The coastline was rendered with near-perfect accuracy, but it was the depiction of the ocean currents that made Aris's blood run cold. Where Finch's map had a single, bold line for his Serpent's Path, this map showed a complex, braided web of conditional currents, some marked with phases of the moon, others with notes about water temperature and salinity. And running through them all, marked not as a permanent feature, but as a transient, conditional pathway, was a current whose location and trajectory perfectly, impossibly, matched the phantom current from her satellite data. The map was signed with a simple, elegant initial, EV. Aris was a scientist, not a historian, but she knew she was looking at something profound. This was not the map of a lucky captain. It was the work of a scientific mind, a mind that had somehow understood and charted a complex, transient oceanographic phenomenon 300 years before the invention of the satellites that were now barely able to detect it. She began to dig into the ship's manifest, searching for the name of the apprentice. She found him, a young man, listed as having died of a tropical fever on a small, uncharted island mid-voyage. His name was Elara Vance, but a footnote in the ship's pay ledger revealed a secret that the captain had tried to bury. A final payment, made to a family in a small coastal village, for the passage not of a son, but of a daughter. Elara Vance was a woman who had disguised herself as a man to chase her obsession with the sea, and who had, it now seemed, paid the ultimate price for her genius. The ghost on Aris's map now had a name, and Aris had a chilling, terrible suspicion that she had not died of a fever, but had been silenced before she could claim her discovery. Chapter 1. The Cartographer's Ghost. For a scientist like Dr. Aris Thorne, coincidence is a dirty word. It is a refuge for the intellectually lazy, a way to explain away the things we do not yet understand. But as she sat in her lab, the ghost of Elara Vance's map glowing on one screen and the phantom from her own satellite data glowing on the other, she was faced with a correlation so perfect, so statistically impossible, that it felt like a violation of the natural order. A 17th century cartographer, a young woman disguised as a boy, armed with nothing but a compass, a sextant, and her own revolutionary mind, had not only discovered a transient ocean current, but had mapped its complex, conditional nature with a precision that Aris's own multi-billion-dollar satellite network could barely replicate. The official story of Captain Alistair Finch, the celebrated hero, now felt like a cheap forgery. He had not been a navigator of supernatural skill. He had been a thief. The woman he had dismissed in his logs as a quiet, unremarkable apprentice was, in fact, the architect of his entire legacy. And the story of her convenient death from a fever on an uncharted island now seemed less like a tragedy and more like the final, brutal act of a cover-up. Aris felt a new, unfamiliar emotion stirring within her. It was not just academic curiosity. It was a cold, quiet rage, a sense of profound, personal injustice. She was a woman in a field still dominated by the ghosts of celebrated men, a scientist who had fought her entire life to have her data and her conclusions taken seriously. In the faint, 300-year-old echo of Elara Vance, she saw a kindred spirit, a sister in science, and she felt a sudden, powerful sense of duty. She was not just solving a data anomaly anymore. She was exhuming a buried life. Her obsession with the phantom current deepened, but its focus shifted. To understand the what of her data, she first had to understand the who of the ghost who had mapped it. She plunged into the archives, this time with a singular goal: to find every trace she could of Elara Vance. The task was almost impossible. As a woman, and as a commoner, Elara's life had been deemed unworthy of the historical record. She was a footnote in another man's story. But Aris was a scientist, trained to find signals in noise. She searched parish records, guild memberships, and the financial ledgers of the shipping company that had funded Finch's expedition. Slowly, painstakingly, a portrait began to emerge. Elara Vance was the daughter of a master watchmaker, a child prodigy who had grown up not with dolls, but with gears and lenses. She was a self-taught mathematician and astronomer, a mind that saw the world not as a chaotic mystery, but as a great and beautiful clockwork mechanism, governed by a hidden set of rules. Her notes, which Aris found tucked away in her father's old workshop ledgers, were filled with complex equations, calculating the gravitational pull of the moon on tides, and theories about how thermal columns in the water could create rivers within the sea. She had not been guessing. She had been calculating. The deeper Aris dug, the more she realized that Elara's map was not just a map. It was the conclusion of a brilliant, revolutionary scientific paper, a paper that had been stolen and its author erased. But the map, as precise as it was, still didn't explain everything. It showed where the current was, and when it might appear, but it didn't explain the most important piece of the puzzle. Why? What was the trigger? What was the underlying mechanism that caused this phantom river to be born and then to die? The answer was not on the map. Aris felt she had hit a wall. She had the ghost's conclusion, but she was missing her proof. Defeated, she returned to the one pure, primary source she had, the map itself. She had been so focused on the currents, on the lines that matched her own data, that she had paid little attention to the map's decorative elements. Like many maps of the era, the borders were filled with artistic flourishes, drawings of sea serpents, sketches of winds blowing from the mouths of cherubs, and an elaborate, beautiful compass rose in the corner. She had dismissed them as mere artistry, but now, looking at them with a mind that was beginning to understand Elara, she realized her mistake. For a mind like Elara Vance, a mind that saw the world as a system of interconnected rules, there was no such thing as mere decoration. She zoomed in on the compass rose. It was a stunning piece of art, but it was also wrong. The cardinal directions were slightly askew, misaligned with the map's own longitude and latitude lines by a few crucial degrees. It was a deliberate, hidden error, a secret signature. Then she looked at the sea serpents. They were not drawn randomly. Their bodies coiled and twisted in specific, repeating patterns. They were not monsters. They were symbols. And the wind from the cherubs' mouths, the lines were not just artistic representations of air. They formed precise geometric angles. A thrilling, impossible idea sparked in Aris's mind. The map was a cipher. It was a multi-layered piece of data encryption, disguised as a work of art. The map itself was the public layer, the part Elara had shown to her captain. But the decorative border was the key, a second, hidden layer of information, meant only for someone who could see past the art and recognize the mathematics hidden within. This was Elara's proof. She had encoded the why of her discovery in a language she knew her brutish, unscientific captain could never hope to decipher. The scientist was now a codebreaker. The ghost of Elara Vance, the watchmaker's daughter, had built a clockwork lock, and Aris was painstakingly reverse engineering its gears. Using her software, she translated the cryptic decorations into a raw data set. The angles of the wind became variables for atmospheric pressure. The coils of the sea serpents became a visual representation of deep-sea thermal vent locations, and the precise angular offset of the compass rose was the final key, a number that unlocked the relationship between all the other variables. She fed this new, strange, 300-year-old data set into her supercomputer. She instructed her model to do something it was never designed to do, to integrate historical, symbolic data with its own real-time satellite feeds. She was asking her perfect, logical machine to listen to a ghost. She hit enter. The simulation began to run. For a moment, the model seemed to collapse, the data streams turning to chaos as the machine tried to reconcile the impossible inputs. Aris held her breath, fearing she had broken her billion-dollar machine with a ghost story. But then, the chaos began to resolve. New patterns began to emerge. Her model, which had never been able to predict the phantom current, which had always seen it as a random, impossible anomaly, was now anticipating it. It was predicting the current's appearance with perfect accuracy, hours before it materialized. It had found the trigger. The secret language of the ghost's map had unlocked the final missing piece of the puzzle, revealing not just a current, but a profound, undiscovered law of the ocean itself. And as Aris stared at her screen, watching her simulation trace the path of the next predicted appearance, a new, cold, and terrifying detail emerged. The current, the ghost river, was not heading out to the empty sea. It was heading directly for the modern, heavily trafficked shipping lanes. And it was moving with a speed and power that her model had never before been able to calculate. The ghost was not just correcting a map. She was screaming a 300-year-old warning. Chapter 2. The Watchmaker's Cipher. Asterisk. The ghost had left behind a key, but it was a key forged in the mind of a watchmaker's daughter. A mind that understood that the most profound secrets are not hidden in vaults, but in plain sight, concealed by the camouflage of beauty. Dr. Aris Thorne, a scientist trained to find signals in the noise of the cosmos, now had to learn to find a signal in the artistry of the past. She knew, with a chilling, intuitive certainty, that the decorative border of Elara's map was not decoration. It was the user's manual for the phantom current. Her lab transformed. It was no longer a place of oceanography. It was a cryptographic war room. She began to dissect the map's artistic elements with the cold, brutal precision of a data analyst. The first piece of the cipher was the compass rose. Her software confirmed its angular offset was a deliberate, mathematically precise deviation. It was not a mistake. It was a primary decryption key, a number that told her how to read the other symbols. She had found the ghost's Rosetta Stone. Next, she turned to the sea serpents, the beautiful, monstrous creatures that coiled in the map's empty spaces. Previous historians had dismissed them as generic maritime art, but Aris, using pattern recognition algorithms, discovered that the coils and twists of their bodies were not random. They formed a repeating non-linear sequence. It was a code. By cross-referencing the patterns with Elara's own notes on water temperature and salinity, Aris made a staggering connection. The serpents were not creatures. They were a visual representation of deep-sea thermal vents, and their coils represented the intensity of the heat they released. Elara had created a symbolic language to map a feature of the ocean floor that would not be physically discovered for another 250 years. The ghost's genius was terrifying, but the final piece of the puzzle was the most elegant. The cherubs, the angelic faces blowing the winds from the corners of the map. Aris analyzed the fine, engraved lines representing the wind. They were not just artistic flourishes. They formed precise geometric angles, a subtle protractor hidden within the art. When she measured these angles and applied the compass rose's key, they translated into specific, quantitative values for atmospheric pressure. She had done it. She had cracked. The cipher, the sea serpents, were the engine, the thermal vents. The cherubs were the trigger, the atmospheric conditions. The map was no longer a static drawing. It was a dynamic, predictive algorithm, an elegant, 300-year-old piece of code, written in the language of art, Elara Vance had not just mapped a current. She had described the precise multivariable formula that gave it birth. Now came the terrible final step. Aris had the ghost's ancient formula, and she had her own modern real-time satellite data. She would now introduce the ghost into her own machine. She fed the variables from Elar's cipher, the thermal vent outputs, the atmospheric pressure values, to her supercomputer's predictive model. She was asking her perfect, logical machine to integrate its own unerring data with the testimony of a ghost. She hit enter. Asterisk. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. The simulation, which had never been able to predict the phantom current, which had always seen it as a random glitch, now saw it with perfect, terrifying clarity. The model was no longer just observing the anomaly, it was anticipating it. It had found the trigger. Elara's cipher had unlocked the final, missing piece of the puzzle. But as Aris watched, a new, cold dread began to creep up her spine. The simulation was not just showing her the past, it was now racing into the future, fed by a rare but predictable convergence of a deep ocean thermal pulse and a specific developing low-pressure weather system. The simulation was predicting that the phantom current was not just going to appear, it was going to manifest with a speed and power far greater than any of the previous, fleeting events. 100-year storm, a perfect convergence. Her screen showed the timeline. The conditions would be met in less than 24 hours. She pulled up the real-time global shipping registry. Her blood ran cold. The predicted path of the Ghost River was not in some empty quadrant of the sea. It was on a direct collision course with one of the most heavily trafficked shipping lanes in the North Atlantic. Dozens of massive container ships, cruise liners, and tankers were, at that very moment, sailing blindly into the serpent's mouth. She was now faced with an impossible choice. She was the only person on the planet who knew what was coming, but her knowledge was based on a ghost story, a conspiracy theory, and a cipher she had extracted from a sea serpent on a 300-year-old map. Who would believe her? To go through official channels would take days. Days she did not have. If she did nothing, hundreds, perhaps thousands, of lives would be lost. If she acted, if she used the Institute's emergency broadcast system to send out an unauthorized, global mayday based on this impossible data, her career, her reputation, her entire life would be over. Asterisk. She looked at the elegant, precise map, drawn by the hand of a woman who had been silenced, and she knew she could not be silent herself. The ghost of Elara Vance had not just sent her a puzzle, she had sent her a warning, and now, Aris Thorne, a woman of data and logic, was about to stake her entire existence on the word of a ghost. She was about to send a message that she knew would save hundreds of lives, and, in the process, destroy her own. Subscribe to the channel, and help us listen to the echoes of the geniuses who drew the maps to the future. He had altered his course, turning his massive, lumbering ship north, away from his assigned route, an act of insubordination that he knew would be the final, ignominious end of his long career. He was now discovering that it was the act that had just saved his life. The sea had erupted, with a speed and violence that defied all meteorological models. The ocean had transformed from a calm swell to a liquid mountain range. Volkov had seen rogue waves before, but this was different. This was not a wave, it was a river, a torrent, of churning, superheated water, moving at over 50 knots, tearing a path through the sea itself. He was at the very edge of the phenomenon, and the force was still enough to toss his 100,000-ton vessel around like a child's toy. Alarms shrieked as containers, stacked like building blocks, groaned under the strain, some snapping their moorings and plunging into the chaotic sea. He was living through a physical impossibility, a storm that no one else had seen coming. Stripped of her career, her credibility, and her freedom, she was being escorted from the building, a pariah. You sent dozens of vessels off course into unsurveyed waters. Dr. Thorne, the lead agent said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. You have caused chaos across the entire Atlantic shipping network. If even one of those ships runs into trouble because of your stunt, we will add involuntary manslaughter to the list of charges. We hope, for your sake, that your ghost story was worth it. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She simply handed them a single, printed sheet of paper. On it were the names of over 60 vessels that had been directly in the path of the anomaly an hour ago. Check their positions, she said, her voice quiet but steady. Check their positions, and then come back and tell me who was endangering them. Aerys of inciting a false panic were now scrambling to respond to a real and completely unforeseen catastrophe of historic proportions. Rescue crews arriving on the scene were met with a maritime graveyard. They found survivors, men and women clinging to debris, their faces blank with shock, all telling the same impossible story, not of a wave or a hurricane, but of a river of boiling violent water that had appeared from nowhere and had torn their steel ships apart as if they were made of paper. The path of devastation, and a cluster of green dots the ships that had listened all safely to the north. Outside the current's deadly wake, he looked at Aris, and for the first time, she did not see an accuser. She saw a man who was struggling to comprehend a miracle. We have confirmed at least a dozen ships lost, he said, his voice now quiet, stripped of its arrogance. But over 40 vessels, 40 that were in the direct path, are reporting safe. They all say the same thing. They received your message. He paused, looking at her as if seeing her for the first time. I have 2 questions, Doctor. First, how in God's name did you know? And second, what is Vance's current? Aris looked from the agent's humbled face to the satellite image on the screen, the digital proof of her vindication. The ghost had been heard. Her warning had saved hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives. But as she looked at the image, a new, cold dread began to form in the pit of her stomach. The simulation on her computer had predicted the current would last for a few hours, and then dissipate. But the real-time data on the agent's tablet was telling a different story. The current wasn't dying, it was stabilizing, and its path was no longer pointing towards the empty ocean. It was turning, slowly, but unmistakably. It was turning towards the coast. Possible task. Stop it. But she couldn't. Her own model, the very one that had predicted the current's birth, was now failing. The phenomenon was behaving in ways that defied all known physics. The energy required to sustain a current of this magnitude should have dissipated within hours. But Vance's current was holding its form, feeding on some unknown power source in the deep ocean. It was no longer a transient anomaly. It had become a stable, terrifying new feature of the Atlantic Ocean. A liquid serpent that was now turning its head towards the land. Her simulation, now running on the world's most powerful supercomputers, painted a doomsday scenario. If the current made landfall, its thermal energy and kinetic force would trigger a weather event of unprecedented violence. A superstorm, a meteorological chimera, combining the flooding of a tsunami with the sustained winds of a Category 5 hurricane. It would be an extinction-level event for the entire coastline, and it was set to make landfall in less than 72 hours. Command center, leaving her bewildered colleagues to their failing muddles, and locked herself in a secure office. On a massive, interactive smartboard, she displayed the high-resolution image of Elara's map. She was no longer just a scientist. She was a medium, preparing for a final, desperate conversation. "All right, Elara," she whispered to the empty room, her voice tight with exhaustion and fear. "The world has finally seen your storm. Now show me how to stop it." She returned to the cipher, to the sea serpents and the cherubs. She had understood them as the triggers, the variables that gave birth to the current. But what if they were more than that? What if they were also a key to its behavior, its life cycle? She began to re-examine the intricate coils of the sea. serpents not as a static pattern, but as a progression. She noticed one of the serpents was drawn differently from the others. It was biting its own tail, the Ouroboros, the ancient alchemical symbol for a self-sustaining, cyclical process. The serpent's symbols, causing a massive, explosive release of thermal energy. This energy, in turn, fed the current, making it stronger, which made the vortex more powerful, which pulled down more cold water. It was a self-sustaining, runaway geothermal engine, a serpent feeding on its own tail, to grow ever more powerful. She had found the engine, but how to turn it off? The answer, she knew, had to be in the final piece of the puzzle she had never understood, the cherubs, the angelic faces blowing the winds. She had used their angles to understand the initial atmospheric pressure, but now she saw them differently. There were 4 cherubs in the 4 corners of the map. 3 were blowing, their cheeks puffed with effort, but the 4th, the one in the northwest corner, was not blowing, it was inhaling. Its lips were pursed, drawing the wind in. The model was clear. A rapid targeted drop in sea surface temperature in the northwest quadrant would be enough to collapse the entire system. The serpent's engine would choke, and the current would dissipate into a series of harmless, chaotic eddies. She had the solution, but it was a solution that came with its own terrible, impossible price. She walked back into the command center, her face grim. She projected her new simulation onto the main screen. She showed them the serpent eating its own tail. She showed them the cherub, the key to its destruction. And then she pointed to the map, to the precise location where the cold front needed to be created. There, she said, her voice heavy. That is the off switch. That is where we have to create the cold front. A 4-star general in the room stared at the location, his face paling. He shook his head. Dr. Thorne, he said, his voice a low growl. That's not possible. That's the exact location of the Calypso array. Aris looked at him, confused. The what? Project Calypso, the general replied, his voice grave. A classified deep-sea network of submarine listening posts. It's our primary, early warning system for enemy naval movements in the Atlantic. Its power source is a next-generation, experimental nuclear reactor, sitting on the seabed. If you are right, if we create a thermal shock of the magnitude you are suggesting in that location, you will trigger a catastrophic failure in that reactor. You might stop the storm, Doctor, but you will trade it for a nuclear meltdown at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. A slow, radioactive death. They were trapped in a perfect, elegant, and utterly monstrous catch-22, a final, terrible puzzle box left by the ghost of Elara Vance. For hours, they debated. The generals argued that the Calypso array was too vital to national security to risk. The environmental scientists argued that a deep-sea meltdown would be an ecological disaster from which the planet might never recover. The politicians argued about the economic fallout. They were all trapped in their own specialized perspectives, unable to see the whole board. But Aris, whose mind was now steeped in the holistic, systemic thinking of Elara Vance, knew they were missing something. The ghost hadn't led them here to a dead end. The puzzle was not yet complete. The cherub wasn't just a location. It was a clue. She retreated once more, back to her secure office, back to her silent communion with the map. She stared at the inhaling cherub, the symbol for the off switch, and she remembered her research. Elara Vance was not just a cartographer. She was a watchmaker's daughter, a mind that understood that the most complex systems are governed not by brute force, but by the smallest, most precise, and most delicate of movements. You don't stop a clock by smashing it with a hammer. You stop it by gently touching the balance wheel. The fit was perfect. The cherub's pursed lips, the inhalation point, corresponded to the exact location of the reactor's primary coolant intake valve. The elegant, swirling lines of wind that the cherub was inhaling were not a weather pattern. They were a perfect 300-year-old diagram of the coolant flow system for a nuclear reactor that wouldn't be invented for 3 more centuries. The room was stunned into silence. Elara Vance had not just predicted a storm and its solution. She had somehow, impossibly, foreseen the existence of the very man-made object that would be sitting on the seabed at that precise location, and had drawn them a map to its most critical, vulnerable component. But by the elegant, precise, and impossibly prescient mind of a woman who had seen the whole board 3 centuries in advance, the ghost of Elara Vance was finally at peace. Her exorcism was complete. Aris Thorne made sure of it. The official report, which she co-authored, did not mention ghosts, but it did, in its opening, unambiguous sentence, give full, primary credit for the discovery of the current, its mechanics, and its solution to the 17th century cartographer and scientist, Elara Vance. Her name was not just cleared, it was etched into the annals of scientific history as one of its greatest and most visionary minds. Her stolen map did not just save a few ships, it saved the world. Her legacy was not just restored, it was made immortal. She's not telling us to drop the temperature of the entire ocean quadrant, Aris explained, her voice trembling with the sheer, terrifying brilliance of the discovery. She's telling us to inject a small, supercooled burst of liquid nitrogen directly into the reactor's coolant intake. It will cause a thermal shock, yes, but a microscopic, targeted one. It won't trigger a meltdown. It will trigger an emergency shutdown. It will take the reactor offline. The Calypso Array's power source is not just a listening post. It's also a massive source of thermal energy, a constant, artificial hotspot on the ocean floor. It's the anchor point. It's the anomaly that has been stabilizing the Serpent's feedback loop. She's not telling us to kill the monster. She's telling us to gently, precisely, put its heart to sleep. It was a gambit of breathtaking audacity. A plan that required them to trust the cartographic ghost of a 17th century watchmaker over their own nuclear physicists. But they were out of options, and the clock was ticking. A deep-sea submersible, the only one in the world capable of the task, was dispatched. The maps of our world are drawn by the victors, but the truth is often written in the margins, in a language that only the patient and the passionate can understand. Here at Crimson Tales, we believe that the greatest discoveries are not found in what is known, but in the anomalies, the glitches, the ghosts, in the data that the official story tries to erase. If you believe that a single brilliant mind can see further than an entire generation, and that some truths are so powerful they can reach across centuries to save us, then join our investigation